sense on a day-to-day level. I think that, I used to think about it a lot in the when I was living in Ohio, and I used to just think about how things were named, how streets were named, how the state was named, that's one part of it. You have such an imprint that indigenous communities had left on a state like that, which, before it, became Ohio and became part of what is still the United States, was all indigenous land of the Shawnee, the Wyandot, and many Delawares, etc. And you have all the counties are named like that now. But I mean, I think it's just to think about, look at the way this country is set up, and, it's hard given, technologically we're moving in one direction so fast. It's hard to see, even see the need to acknowledge this history, but that everything in the country and how it exists is contingent upon that project of what can only be called genocidal extermination. I mean, and that sounds very harsh for a lot of people, and there are a lot of excuses that are made, but that's really what it ended up being. And to be honest, I before coming, I made sure to bring some of these quotes. I think this would be helpful to sort of understand what was part of engaging with colonialism, is to try to understand what were some of the people who were involved in it, how did they think about it, and how those thoughts continue to shape, the current situation that we're faced with, or the nature of the United States as itself. And so this is a Thomas Jefferson quote, who obviously is remembered as, in only positive ways. Maybe once in a while you hear that he owned slaves, but basically he said, however our present interests may restrain us within our own limits, it is impossible not to look forward to distant times when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits and cover the whole northern, if not the southern continent, with the people speaking the same language, governed in similar form by similar laws. And so you saw this sort of vision that the United States, from its founding, had of westward expansion, southern expansion, all forms of expansion, limitless expansion. And today it's being able, the state has been able, the U.S. state has been able to achieve some of these things, maybe without using direct mechanisms of control and going, I mean, obviously we've seen many examples of them actually going in and removing someone, putting in a puppet regime. But I think there's so many mechanisms, implicit mechanisms, in which the state maintains control and has sought to always control, other countries for economic purpose, based on racial ideology, which, it believes in this idea of, sort of white superiority and sort of national pride about American exceptionalism, that America is the greatest country ever, and that everything can be justified on the basis of, America being the greatest country, that it should be able to do whatever it sees fit. And I think that just thinking about some of those things, in terms of just reflecting deeply on America's history, reflecting on why any of this was even possible, and in any place that we're in, how that history of colonial expansion and, the sort of harsh treatment that Native Americans, indigenous folks in this country faced, that none of this would be possible without it.
One of the interesting things that we discovered when we were searching arduously for colonization, what it is, there were a lot of words. Globalization is a type of colonization. We found words that were very strange. Coca-colonization, because Coca-Cola is everywhere in the world, and they are Pepsi, but their programs are will roll over anything. They bribe. They do all these. The research proved to be actually terrifying. Makes you not want. I don't anyway, but don't want to drink them anymore. It's like a colonization through spread of our projects, our products, our culture, through drink Coca-Cola today, and they do this without sending any people, though, other than just a couple of hitmen once in a while, or a few little people with satchels of money once in a while. And then they set up these companies in these, like India would probably have Coca-Cola plants, Coca-Cola executives, but they're still responsible to the colonizer, which is us, whether we like it or not. So, and then there were others. Walmartization. Walmart's everywhere. Disneyfication. McDonaldization, or my favorite, Macworld. So get your Big Mac anywhere. And so there's even something called the Bismack. The Bismack Index. It's an informal measure of purchasing power parity among currencies in the world based on these companies and their expansion. And I think this is covered in some of the books who was it? I can't remember offhand because I didn't write any of this part down. It's just coming to me as you were talking. The Hitman, the economic hitman. Talk about how we go in and we set up these things so that we can take over the countries by putting them into debt and them not being able to pay. And then you can pay us in your resources. And so we walk away very rich, which was the plan from the beginning. So it's a particularly insidious type of colonization as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously completely agree. And I think that's maybe getting to this other layer of what the project of colonialism and all of its different manifestations, what it's actually meant, is that, we can identify explicit things, this extraction and control kind of mechanisms. But I think the more pernicious aspects relate to erasing people, erasing histories, and actually changing the way people think about day-to-day life, about themselves, about their identities, and I think that's the part about, it's hard to sort of draw this straight line, country becomes independent, you cut off the history in terms of, well, it was colonized before and it became independent now. And, there's some people who are perpetually colonized people, and I would say, indigenous Americans are among those. But, even with that, it's like, even after this process of so-called independence emerges, I think the most insidious aspects really relate to how it profoundly shapes the administrative structures and political practices of a state that they inherit from the colonial, and how, obviously in terms of language, how a particular language comes in a very hegemonic manner and displaces others and reduces diversity of languages in a particular place. And, especially getting to the more, some of the things that you were talking about in terms of, these companies coming in as a part of, economic liberalization, globalization, how, anything from food practices to, just sort of the day-to-day, what you think about, things that you do in terms of consumption on a regular basis is profoundly shaped essentially by external forces that are very hegemonic in the way that they, you can't even compare, if it's locally owned business that sells some set of products versus like a globally hegemonic, company like McDonald's with its kind of marketing outreach, with its kind of saturation of a particular place, that people's ideas about something as simple as this, what am I going to eat, change. And it can displace, other patterns of existence, other patterns of behavior. And those displacements produce a lot of negative outcomes, because I never heard of incorporating McDonald's or incorporating Coca-Cola into your diet and that being a positive change. And I mean,
not even here is it a positive change, actually.
Yeah. So I think that's getting to another layer of how these things affect people's lives on a day-to-day level.
So you spent, you said a year abroad, right?
2 years in Nepal and about a year in India before that as a journalism student, yeah.
Now, when we think of India, we think of the colony, of the British colony for so long. What changes did you see that would show that there's been major overall of that colonialism? Well,
I mean, I think one would definitely identify the fact that, the possibility of an independent state, and all of the things that come out of that in terms of, the infrastructure projects that are forwarded, sort of national level projects that are undertaken by a newly independent state, which at that point, despite what British colonial apologists claim, levels of literacy and education are quite low, extremely low, actually. It wasn't as if, they usually, British colonial apologists talk about, we set up infrastructure, they set up infrastructure for extraction, and they set up administration for the purposes of control. They set up military institutions and installations for the purpose of control. So you could say, oh, well, the new Indian state inherited some of these things, but some of the things needed to be remade. I think there's a big debate about whether those things were actually remade or reconstituted to make it truly independent and to take a trajectory which is a lot different. I think that, the question of colonialism in India is a difficult one because, there were folks who were marginalized by the upper echelons of Indian society before colonialism started. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, that sometimes when this sort of newly independent state forms, the people who end up taking over have been oppressors in their own way for a long stretch of time. And so it's almost like the colonial power sort of identifies a section of folks to hand power over to. And those people have been, have been exploitative and oppressive in their own ways. And I think that's definitely been the case in the Indian context, where you had a class, and it really should be said the caste, an upper caste elite that took over the control of the state. Fortunately, the Constitution is very progressive in orientation and was written by someone from a lower caste background. And so, you have, Dr. Ambedkar, who basically made sure that there were provisions of affirmative action type programs that, one has to see that as like the independent state. Then there are certain opportunities that were made available, but you still saw, and you saw a little bit of a diversification over time in terms of who controlled that state. But as it exists today, you have mostly a section of people who are upper caste, upper class elites running the state, and now they're working at the behest of their seemingly corporate overlords who are looking for profit. And that nexus is sort of represents its own form of colonialism on Indian people today, I think, without question.
Sounds like the situation we have here a bit,
Yes, it does. And as I'm listening to you talking, the thread that seems to run through colonization in its various forms is the loss of culture of the indigenous population. Mm-hmm. And even when the colonizer leaves, as the English left in India, not the American example, there still seems to be incredible change. We came across two other types of colonization, which I'll just mention very briefly. One was hybridization, and this is where cultures kind of meld together. They mix across continents or regions, and what emerges from that is neither one culture nor the other. And then there's homogenization, which I can best describe as the U.S. theory of the melting pot or assimilation, which was always painted as this very positive thing. Come to our shores, everyone is welcomed. We are the great melting pot, all come and all have a place. But what it really meant, in fact, was if you come with your culture, we expect you to leave it at the door. We expect you to become American, to speak English, to dress American. And what got lost, of course, was the cultures of the people who came.
Essentially to become white.
Yes, but that's right. The melting pot and assimilation only worked if you could just melt right in, if you could become American, not if you were a dark-skinned person, and certainly not if you were an Asian person, somebody who could not melt on the outside and just give up their cultures. So now that we've looked at colonization in its various forms, we came to the next, much more difficult question about what it means to decolonize. First thing we discovered as we looked through a lot of publications, we looked through the internet, we discovered that the topic of decolonization is almost totally missing. Other than Ward Churchill and a few other academics, there was no reference to decolonization by those we consider to be the leading voices of resistance today. So it's made the whole discussion about decolonization much more challenging. We're going to start by talking about decolonization and giving you some of the definitions. So, Albert, do you want to start?
Well, I'm still interested a little bit.
Okay.
Back on the other thing, too. decolonization. But I'm coming from a different perspective, which is why this has been so difficult for Barbara as well as myself, any of us, without realizing it. It wasn't until Washington, D.C., that we were at the American University there, and Chase Ironeyes made a statement. He said, we've all been colonized at one point or another. And that's when it really hit home that we have been, without realizing it. And in the interim, we have become not only the past victims, but now we're the new colonizers without even thinking about it. It's just our duty to do this sort of thing. So to think of decolonization, what would you just envision briefly that would entail?
Yeah, that's wow. I know that this is the more difficult part, where we can identify all of the things that, sort of these deep histories, but I think coming up with sort of futures. I mean, part of it I think is to acknowledge. I think part of decolonizing is actually to acknowledge that history that came, that sort of shapes. I think to acknowledge history makes the present. I think that, and so any day that you're an American, any day that you're in this country is itself a colonial moment, and that I think that that's a big part
I'm
of
learning that, yes.
Part of decolonizing is about, understanding and acknowledging that as often as possible, and to acknowledge, the pretty substantial crimes and that have been committed against Indigenous folks, but, beyond crimes is not even the right word, but just to acknowledge that history, I think, is a big part of it. So I think I would link the two of like acknowledging that history. I think one of the things is, rather than, and I've maybe even done this a little bit, is, we're talking about the crimes of colonialism, the sort of atrocities committed in colonialism. I think a big part of decolonizing also is to understand that all of these things were met, all of these sort of attempts to expand, like sort of colonial expansion attempts to take over another place were met with fierce resistance. And I think foregrounding this history of anti-colonial struggles everywhere tells you a different history, or tells history in a different way, I should say, and helps us understand, like, who do we see ourselves aligned with historically also. And it wasn't just a matter of, the colonizer came in and took over, but they, people, even with lack of weapons, facing machine guns, still resisted. And I think that those are really important things to remember and carry forward. So I think that that's a big part, like acknowledging sort of what colonialism is and how it shapes our existence day to day, and how, to be honest, how it shapes the global system and how it's structured. I think that's sort of essential to sort of the decolonizing project. And I think that also just to look at the examples, like to sort of start that process, looking at the examples of what anti-colonial struggles were able to produce, why there may have been shortcomings in terms of the states that they were able to take over, and how that sort of falling short actually relates directly back to how pernicious colonialism actually is. So I would sort of start with the sort of acknowledging the sort of historical elements, and sort of understanding, from that, sort of letting that be the starting point, and kind of building decolonization from there.
I got the opportunity to talk to Ward Churchill for a few moments, and he wanted to know my history. So I'm Irish. He said, well, we've got a lot to learn from the Irish. He said, you stood up and you fought to the end. And so that's a good thing. But I see hope also in some of the resistance movements in South America, the Zapatistas, mm-hmm. and all the political movements all throughout the South America. That is, and also the First Nations of Canada now, standing up more and coherently, really standing up together. That's a positive thing for me. So the idea that one nation has control of another, that's colony. That makes them a colony, colonization. Or one people, even in absentia, controlling another people, which we don't always view as that, like we do it through economics. Still colonization. The destruction of cultures, so that if you take away people's culture, you reduce them. I wanted to ask you something about India, because it hit me while you were talking about it. The educational system, which is something we want to get into on this show eventually, but the educational system is sometimes set up just to produce cogs in the wheel to keep the system going. So there's really, they say we have a great educational system we've set up, even if people can read and write. Generally, it's kept at a certain level just so they can fill the things needed by the colonizer themselves. They won't let too much go beyond that. Did you find that in India?
Well,
just the way you said it,
yeah,
it piqued my interest.
No, I mean, I think that's a great question. And, I probably know a little bit about this, not as much as I should. But basically, I would say that it was the independent Indian state trying to come up with a fully functioning educational system. And that's hampered it from the time of its inception in terms of, having government-run schools that were funded properly, that, had the resources necessary. Even something like that is shaped profoundly by the colonial experience and the difficulty. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that's sort of a part of it, but I think, what was the project of the new Indian state? Sort of developing education as a part of is sort of crucial for this, but like the bigger project was how do you, all nationalism at that time, Indian nationalism was sort of a motivating impulse in different forms. Indian nationalism and different types of nationalism play a role in anti-colonial struggle. But when you take over an independent state, it's not as if, these sort of neat lines and boundaries about, different within a country and even externally, like all of those things as seen in the Indian state, after the British left, there's a partition that, left, that ended up with the partition of India and Pakistan. About 1 million people died in that sort of transfer of people. And you see a situation there where it's like the whole idea that you have to consolidate this national project and that you have to consolidate. I think that was a big part that played a role in the education system. And I think has always shaped the education system. You have to actually produce citizens of a state, and they have to acknowledge themselves as Indian. And many of them have never acknowledged themselves before that as Indian. And today, when I was in journalism school, we had people who were from different parts of the country who refused to acknowledge themselves as Indian. You might meet someone from Kashmir who says that they're part of Indian-occupied Kashmir. They might be from a northeastern state in the country, and they say that I'm not Indian, I'm Manipuri, or I'm some other identity. And, on the other side of things, people identify along very narrow ethnic lines or caste lines, probably caste more than anything else. And so the whole idea of consolidating a state, the education system then has to play that role. And so, the state tries to make it play that role. How do we make these people citizens and acknowledge the flag and acknowledge the rituals of nationalism? And that is a project that's ongoing. And I think that's been a really unfortunate shortcoming of the education system in India, other than being very under-resourced and having to, deal with sort of widely expanding sort of private school system that wealthier people can afford. You have this situation where, it's always been subordinated to a particular kind of project of consolidating the state, which is not really conducive for critical thinking. It's actually mostly conducive for producing a certain type of person.
We have that problem here, I think the same problem. Okay.
Yeah, I mean the myth telling. I really appreciate that you brought that up, because who tells the story and how they tell the story is incredibly significant for going forward. So if the story is told in such a way that the colonizers are always the good guys and the people they've colonized are the bad guys who got in the way, you have a very different perspective on what you need to do going forward, which is certainly true in this country and is something we definitely need to overcome. So when we start talking about decolonization, it seems like a mountain that there's no way possible you could ever climb. We are so embedded in who we are and what we are right now that is there any way to get beyond that? What could we possibly do? Could we go back to 1492? Could we go back to 1500? I mean, it's almost too hard to even comprehend. So we look at, we all look at Standing Rock, and one of its greatest contributions is the awakening of us all to colonization, and the reality that there's a necessity to decolonize if justice and peace would ever be achieved. And, just how is it that we do that?
We have some options we thought about as we're going through this. How can you decolonize? We could go on and do nothing and just leave this unjust situation as it is. And there are a lot of people who want to do that. You don't want to admit anything. The other is to negotiate a settlement for reparations and land swap or in an attempt to move toward justice. But another is to go back to a specific date, as she mentioned before, perhaps 1860s or whatever it is. And the old treaties now will be finally recognized. We'll find one treaty in all of history that we can abide by, which we haven't found one yet, but we're working on that. So I don't know. I don't think any of us know what this decolonization is going to look like in the future, but it is something that has to be done. Otherwise, we can't really survive. So, there are other options, such as we could change our concept of property. That's one thing, from ownership to use, and the commons, which is a very important issue. I think that we're all going to have to face in the future. We can change our mindset from the settler concept. Indigenous peoples have the opportunity to learn their culture again, their songs, their ways to speak and think in their own language. So those are some important things, I think. I hope.
Absolutely. And we talked about what could those steps be in decolonizing. We've talked about waking up just to understand the concepts, where we are, where we've been, where we need to go. And then to educate, to build a movement toward decolonization, to agitate, to resist even, to take action. And then finally, to revolt, to take down the current system, which is a colonial-based system, and rebuild in a different kind of way. What if we look at decolonization as anarchy, the freedom of people to overthrow the state, the masters, the colonizers, and move to where your spirit takes you? This may have nothing to do with your DNA, especially if you happen to be people without a land. But is that a possibility? What do you think, Rajiv?
Yeah, it's
short. We're long.
Yeah,
yes,
sure.
Sure. We're almost done out of time.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I think that's all of what you said. Those are the same notes that I had in terms of, especially in terms of re-envisioning property relations and thinking about the commons and thinking about indigenous histories and what indigenous folks have to say about the predicament today and different ideas about how we can structure life today. I think and other aspects of it would be in these places where colonialism happened, to acknowledge things like reparations as a possibility. I know countries that were colonized claim reparations, and to sort of understand in all the different places where colonialism still exists or the remnants of it, to try to address it.
You mentioned something very important, and that was you have to recognize the past. You have to change it in the first place. Now, I understand Germany has made big steps in this. Everywhere you go, there is a monument to that past. Here in Savannah in the South, we haven't made that yet when it comes to our own issues with slavery. We really have to change that because all the history that's presented from all the tours is a very one-sided point of view. And that has to be changed, too, if we're ever going to overcome our problems.
So we are going to continue this conversation in the next show because we are clearly running out of time. We will also have more of a focus on the indigenous perspective with our guest, Laura Shadley. Before we say goodbye today, though, however, we want to give you some community announcements. On Friday, May 19th, there will be a benefit for the Standing Rock Legal Defense Fund at 9 o'clock at the Wormhole. On Saturday, we will have our gathering at the Thomas Square Garden, Edible Park, and we welcome all to come to share in a light breakfast and get your hands in the soil. And then on Sunday, May 21st, Veterans for Peace will host a movie, The Invisible War, at 7 o'clock at the Sentient Bean. So I